Okay, welcome everybody. This will be part two of what I started yesterday, reading a book by Prince Yusupov. Full title is Rasputin, His Malignant Influence and His Assassination. And this book was published, this version was published in many forms, but one I'm reading from is from 1927. So I'll pick up where we left off. And I'll also put a link in the show notes to all these other episodes I've done, which is now at like 42, about me reading just a variety of different history books. So if you're interested in that topic, they're set out from my standard podcast episodes that are on Spreaker, used to be on Spotify, and now they're being distributed in a lot of places because I got my YouTube channels back about 7-8 months ago. But here we go, picking up where we left off. It's interesting where I left off last time is Yusupov brings it kind of full circle as he talks about Rasputin dying in St. Petersburg and then the Romanov family dying, being shot at this place close to where Rasputin was from. So they were taken into Siberia. The Nicholas II, his wife, they have these kind of long names. I'm having the Russian translations are interesting, but she was the Tsarina or something like the wife of Nicholas II was from Germany. And he goes on to explain their interest in mysticism, her interest, the hemophilia of the air, and just the family dynamics. I mean, this is kind of up close personal things that you may not get in a standard kind of topical analysis of the royal family, but it just shows the difference in personalities. And also of Rasputin. It's interesting because some people in the show notes say that Rasputin is made to sainthood. They don't know anything about the occult because Rasputin is doing things just, and we'll see this in this book, you'll be blown away. Nobody really covers this, but he had knowledge of magnetism, a lot of the stuff at the turn of the century. So he was in contact. He also made all the Masonic hand gestures, like just so many. There's one where he's putting his hand across his chest, and like Crowley, Crowley interestingly was in Russia for the 1905 upheaval, which is mentioned in this book. He was traveling around with this girl troupe, but it is an interesting overlay. And it is mentioned in here that before Rasputin, they had an interest in this other French kind of occultist. The family did, the royal family. But anyway, you can check out my other shows, and this will be part two, like I said, so you can go back and listen to part one. But this is really a fascinating book. You have to take this with a grain of salt. But I do think it has a ring of truth. And a lot, he's willing to talk about kind of darker elements of Rasputin. Not a Christian saint. He's a fake Christian. Like Rasputin to me is obviously a fake Christian. He does not adhere to the core tenets with regularity. He's just bouncing around, and he knows a lot about the occult and esotericism as well. And we'll see that play out through the 20th century. It's a very important vein of 20th century history because a lot of the political leaders knew this. And Rasputin has to be seen as a political leader, not just a cultural figure or a so-called Christian figure of the Orthodox Church. So here we go. I'm on page 41. You see people might want to read along. You can get a copy of this book through archive.org if you're interested. But, here we go. There would seem to be no inherent connection between Rasputinism and Bolshevism. Yet the link is there, and is a very strong one. Rasputin was the personification of that obscure power which rises from the depths of life and is pregnant with the seeds of disintegration and disruption of all moral principles. He was the forerunner of coming infamies and terrors. A muzhik in his greasy boots, he would say of himself, entered the palace and traipsed about the imperial parquets. With those greasy boots, he tramped down the people's ancient faith in the purity and justice of the Tsar's calling. Throughout the whole of his career, there lurked in the person of Rasputin the seeds of approaching Bolshevism, with its ignorance, greed, cynicism, and depravity, with its dark passion for power, its denial of responsibility before God or man. Rasputin became a weapon in the hands of Russia's enemies. But were the Germans her only enemy? Or did there stand behind Rasputin some other power? A power which sought the political enfeeblement of Russia and her moral disintegration and destruction in order to strengthen its own diabolical hold on her. Rasputin duped the Empress and the Emperor who trusted him. The Bolsheviks duped the whole of the Russian people, who blindly followed them in some sort of wild, intoxicated, chilistic ecstasy of revolution. Unknown to himself, Rasputin was, in a sense, the first commissary of Bolshevism. He had drawn near to the throne in order to trample on its might and extinguish its majesty. Others followed him. Rasputinism paralyzed the supreme power because it did not meet with a strong and organized opposition among influential people, prompted solely by ideas of duty and by purely moral motives. Bolshevism likewise met with no obstacle. Flabbiness, confusion, vanity, party blindness, and self-seeking, the absence of a united national idea, the illusion of revolution, hung like a poisonous mist over those Russians who found themselves in power after the fall of the monarchy. Under cover of this mist, the enemies of Russia stealthily crept up and dealt her the long premeditated blow. Stunned and bewildered, the people readily fell into their hands. Bolshevism dropped its anchor in a foul and muddy pool. It caught the refuse of every class of society. It brought with it a whole army of aliens for whom Russia could never be a home, for whom Russia was and is a stranger's house, given over to them to be plundered and defiled. A great country became the home of the most appalling depravity and the most monstrous crimes. Unheard of outrages were inflicted on the defenseless people. Russia was transformed into a laboratory for the preparation of poisons destined for the destruction of all mankind. In the world, there was not, nor has there yet been found, a power ready to rise up unhesitatingly in defense, not of the Russian people only, but of all that is best in morals and in culture. Civilized countries live in close contact with the leprosy of Bolshevism. They stretch out a hand to the servants of the devil and are not choked by the moral rot and stench which, like poison gas, are spread over the entire earth by that criminal organization, the Third International. Peoples and their governments do not seem to understand that Bolshevism is something more than a mere form of administration closely fitted into the framework of the Soviets. They do not realize that first and foremost it is a moral perversion, a terrible and complicated disease of mankind of today, a disease which stifles conscience, duty, and honor. Bolshevism paralyzes and destroys the heritage of long centuries of spiritual culture. It gradually transforms man into a civilized brute, governed by his lowest instincts and devoid of all needs of a higher order. Bolshevism is the most determined enemy of Christianity. It is as if the powers of darkness were endeavoring to storm the heavens. It was not without meaning that the communists staged the trial of God and repudiated and condemned him. The church, the mainstay and the crown of Russia, alone withstood the onslaught of the revolution. She overcame within herself the virus of Rasputinism, which had done its best to poison her. She has not yet yielded to the force or threats or to the disintegration and corruption of Bolshevism. She has saved and is saving the soul of the Russian people with all its high moral qualities. She is destined to face the formidable task of Russia's moral cleansing. Purification is essential. Without it, no new life can be built up and no new system of government can be established. Any form of government which is not founded on all that is best in the spiritual life of the people will prove frail and fleeting and will end in a repetition of the terrible calamity of 1917, when a throne which had stood firm for centuries collapsed, having lost, thanks to Rasputin, its moral authority. Documents exposing Bolshevism and the Soviet government are published in all languages. A whole new literature has appeared, a literature which by no means exhausts the terrible truth. The whole world reads books which are written in blood, and yet remains indifferent not only to the position of Russia, but to its own ultimate fate. Humanity of today is blind to everything save the small concerns of the moment, petty personal interests, and the thirst for immediate success. It closes its eyes to the spectacle of a great country, exhausted and bleeding, struggling alone against the powers of darkness. Is not this also a form of Rasputinism, which has gained possession of our epoch and of the whole of mankind today, Paris 1926. And then that's the picture I showed of Rasputin making that hand gesture, sign of the claw. The end of Rasputin, Chapter 1, How I Made Rasputin's Acquaintance. My first meeting with Rasputin was at the G's house in St. Petersburg in 1909. I had known the G's for years, my particular friend being their daughter, M. As everything connected with the name of Rasputin is apt to excite a feeling of disgust, I would like to add a few words concerning M to distinguish her from the Rasputin clan. She was exceptionally pure-minded, good-natured, and responsive, and unusually impressionable. There was as much nervous exaltation in her character. But thanks to this, her spiritual impulses always predominated over her reason. Religion played the chief part in her life, but her religious feelings were tinged with an unhealthy mysticism. Trustful to excess, she was totally incapable of judging either people or facts. When anything surprised her, she blindly yielded to the impression which it made on her. She remained wholly under the influence of those in whom she had once believed, and she did not readily distinguish good from evil. In these circumstances, it was not a matter for surprise that Rasputin should be a frequent visitor at the G's. When I returned from abroad in 1909, I found that M was one of his ardent admirers. She sincerely and firmly believed in his uprightness and spiritual purity. She regarded him as one of God's elect, as an almost supernatural being. Her infatuation for the starets did not surprise me in the least. Rasputin, with his natural perspicacity, was not slow to see in her his future devotee. He divined her spiritual leanings and gained her complete confidence. M's purity prevented her from seeing the grime and horror that hung about the man. She was too naive to form any true estimate of his actions. Her greatest joy lay in the full spiritual subjection of her personality. She was happy to have found a holy guide. Not only did she fail to analyze the qualities of this teacher, but she timidly withdrew her into herself whenever she felt anyone trying to expose him. The ideal which she had formed in her imagination of the divine starets blotted out the true Rasputin from her sight. At our first meeting after my return, she began to talk about him. She described him as a man of rare spiritual strength, filled with God's blessing, who had been sent into the world to cleanse and heal our hearts and to guide our wills, thoughts, and conduct. I remember that I adopted a skeptical attitude, although at that time I had nothing particular against Rasputin. Indeed, I had heard very little about him. Knowing M, I decided that she was simply passing through one of the usual phases of enthusiasm typical of her highly strung nature. But something in her words seemed to arouse my curiosity. I asked her many questions. With great animation and enthusiasm, M proceeded to tell me more about the shining personality of the starets. Her story was one long eulogy. Rasputin was a healer. He interceded for mankind. He was an altruist, a peacemaker, a comforter of the sorrow-stricken. He was a new apostle, God's chosen emissary. He stood on a different plane from the rest of mankind. He knew no human weaknesses nor vices, and his whole life was spent in asceticism and prayer. M's fervor and conviction did not inspire me with any faith in the miraculous gifts of the starets, but they increased my curiosity and roused in me a desire to meet him. I told her that I should like to make the acquaintance of this remarkable man. She was quite delighted with my suggestion, and the meeting was not long delayed. Some days later, I drove up to G's house on the Winter Canal, where this first meeting was to take place. When I entered the drawing room, Rasputin had not yet arrived. M was seated with her mother at the tea table. Both were very nervous and excited, especially the daughter, who seemed to be in a state of suppressed anxiety. I felt that she was nervous about the first impression that Rasputin would make on me, and that at the same time she desired that I, like herself, should be inspired with veneration for him. Both mother and daughter seemed to be in a state of devout tension, as if the arrival of a wonder-working icon was awaited in the house. This attitude still further excited my curiosity and desire to see this wonderful man. We did not have to wait long. The door leading from the hall soon opened, and Rasputin walked in with a mincing gait. He came straight towards me and with the words, "Good day, my dear," made a movement as if to embrace me. I drew back. With a sly, sickly smile, he went forward to M and her mother. He embraced them both without any ceremony. kissing them with an air of gracious condescension. My first glance at him filled me with dislike of his appearance. There was something repugnant about him. He was of medium height, thick-set, yet rather thin, with long arms. His big head was covered with an untidy tangle of hair. Above his forehead there was a bald patch, which, as I subsequently learnt, came from a blow administered to him when he was beaten for horse stealing. He seemed to be about 40 years old. He was wearing a long coat, wide trousers, and long boots. His face was of the most ordinary peasant type, a coarse oval with large, ugly features overgrown with a slovenly beard and with a long nose. His small gray eyes looked out from under bushy eyebrows with piercing yet shifty glances. His whole bearing attracted attention. He appeared unconstrained in his movements, yet there seemed to be something dissembled about him, something suspicious, cowardly, and searching. All these details did not, of course, strike me at our first meeting. He greeted us and sat down for a moment. Then he rose and for some time walked about the room with his quick, short steps, muttering incoherently to himself. His voice was thick and his pronunciation indistinct. We drank our tea and looked at him in silence, M with enraptured attention, I with curiosity and distrust. At last he came to the tea table, settled down in an armchair by my side, and began to submit me to a searching scrutiny. The conversation about nothing in particular was started. Rasputin, apparently wishing to maintain the tone of one inspired from above, held forth in a dictatorial manner. His speech was quick, voluble, yet often faltering. He quoted scripture texts which had no connection with each other, and his words gave the impression of something involved, if not chaotic. As he talked, I carefully watched his expression. There was certainly something unusual in this mujik's features. The longer I examined him, the more I was struck by his eyes. They were amazingly repulsive. Not only was there no trace of spiritual refinement in the face, it called to mind that of a cunning and lascivious satyr. The peculiarity of his eyes was that they were small, almost colorless, and too closely set in large, exceptionally deep sockets, so that from a distance they were not visible. They seemed to get lost in the depths of their recesses. Hence, it was often difficult to see whether they were open or not, and only the feeling that a needle was piercing through you told you that he was looking at you and examining you closely. His keen and penetrating gaze did, in fact, convey a feeling of some hidden supernatural power. His smile, too, was arresting. It was sickly yet cruel, cunning, and sensual. Indeed, the whole of his being was redolent of something unspeakably revolting, hidden under the mask of hypocrisy and cant. Em was full of excitement at the presence of Rasputin. Her eyes shone, her cheeks burned with a nervous flush. She and her mother did not take their eyes off of him. With bated breath, they caught at every word the starets uttered. At last he rose, enveloped us all in would-be loving and caressing glance, and turned to me and said, while he pointed to Em, "What a true friend you have in her. Listen to her, and she will be your spiritual wife. Yes, she has spoken well of you, told me many things. And now I see for myself that you are suited to each other. My dear, I do not know your Christian name. You will go a long way, a very long way." And with these words, he left the room. I also took my leave, absorbed in my impressions of this enigma. A few days later, I heard from M that Rasputin had taken a great liking to me and that he wanted to meet me again. Chapter 2. Anxiety among loyal subjects of the throne. Soon after my first meeting with Rasputin, I left for England and went up to Oxford. On one occasion, when I was visiting an English princess closely related to the Empress Alexandra Fyodorovna, our conversation turned on him. The princess listened to my stories about him with great interest. She fully realized the danger to Russia involved in his proximity to the court, and after briefly sketching the mental characteristics of the Empress Alexandra Fyodorovna, she expressed a fear that certain of those traits, especially her leaning towards morbid mysticism, might cause grave complications in the future if Rasputin were to remain near the royal family. At that time, my parents lived in St. Petersburg and spent the summer in Tsarskoye Selo. My mother was much liked by the Empress Alexandra Fyodorovna and was often with her. Rasputin's proximity to the emperor and empress greatly perturbed her, and in her letters to me, she often mentioned her anxiety. She also communicated her fears to the Grand Duchess Elizabeth Fyodorovna, a friend of many years' standing. The Grand Duchess, who resided in Moscow, shared all her apprehensions, and during her rare visits to St. Petersburg, she exerted every effort to persuade the Emperor and Empress to dismiss the pernicious starets. At that time, the danger of Rasputin's presence at Tsarskoye Selo was not generally realized. His appearance at the court probably a mere chance, and only later, when the enemies of Russia and the dynasty found a field of action ready prepared for them, realizing how all-powerful Rasputin had become, and to what extent autocracy was in his hands, were they able to make use of him for their own ends. My mother was one of the first openly to oppose Rasputin. She had a long conversation with the Empress, and quite frankly told her all that she thought on this matter. Her words made a great impression on the Empress, who apparently understood my mother's sincerity and felt the justice of her conclusions. In parting from her, the Empress, in most touching terms, expressed a wish to see her as often as possible. But Rasputin's friends were not slumbering. They fully realized the danger of such an intimacy and contrived to win back their control over the Empress's sick imagination and gradually to alienate her from my mother. Many members of the imperial family, with the Dowager Empress Marie Fyodorovna at their head, also tried to influence the Emperor and Empress, but in vain. And then began a struggle between those who were sincerely devoted to Russia and the throne, and those who shamelessly used Rasputin's influence to gain access to the Emperor and Empress, and so further their own selfish ends and secret political schemes. From childhood, I had been accustomed to look upon the imperial family as people apart, different from ourselves. I held them in veneration as beings of a higher order, girt with a sort of halo that set them beyond all criticism. Any aspersion cast upon them filled me with indignation, and I paid no attention to the stories I heard of Rasputin's relations with the court. In the autumn of 1912, I came down from Oxford and returned to my home in Russia. I had many plans for the future, but they were still rather vague. My meeting with Princess Irina Alexandrovna altered my fate. In a short time, our engagement was announced. At the outbreak of war, I was in Germany with my wife and parents. By order of the Kaiser Wilhelm, we were arrested in Berlin. We escaped by a miracle and reached Copenhagen, where we found the Dowager Empress who brought us safely to St. Petersburg. The enthusiasm provoked by the declaration of war had already begun to subside, and many people were pessimistically inclined. Tsarskoye Selo was enveloped in gloom. The Emperor and Empress, cut off from the world, out of touch with their subjects, surrounded by the Rasputin clan, were deciding questions of worldwide importance. Could this forebode anything but disaster? Chapter 3. Rasputin is revealed to me. And so there was no hope that the Emperor and Empress would ever understand the full truth about Rasputin and dismiss him from the court. What other steps, therefore, could be taken to deliver the Emperor and Russia from this evil genius? The thought arose, there is only one way, to put an end to the criminal starets. The idea first entered my head after a conversation with my wife and mother as far back as 1915, when we had been discussing the terrible effects of Rasputin's influence. The subsequent march of political events made me turn to it again, and it took firm root in my mind. The representations made by the members of the royal family against Rasputin were followed by a number of open demonstrations of a public character, both by individuals and by various organizations. Reports were submitted, resolutions were drawn up, and collective appeals were made to the supreme power. But the Emperor and Empress remained deaf to all supplications, advice, warnings, and threats. The more Rasputin was opposed, the more convincing the evidence against him, the less attention was paid to the matter at Tsarskoye Selo. He was indeed impregnable. He made such adroit use of his assumed mask of hypocrisy that no credence whatever was given there to reports of his profligacy. An eloquent illustration of this is afforded by the following incident. General Zhunkovsky, vice minister of the interior, wishing to confront the empress with clear proof that the stories of Rasputin's revolting behavior were only too true, showed her some photographs taken during one of his lewd orgies in a St. Petersburg restaurant. On seeing this incontrovertible evidence, the empress was terribly indignant and ordered immediate and searching inquiries to be made regarding the identity of the person who dared to sully Rasputin's reputation by posing as the starets. At a time when patriotic Russians were in despair at their failure to destroy the root of evil, the German party, having in the starets such a valuable assistant, naturally triumphed. Already at the outbreak of the war, Rasputin was almost at the summit of his influence and power. During the period that followed, honorable and devoted servants of the crown were one by one dismissed, even those who were on terms of personal friendship with the emperor himself, and their places were filled by Rasputin's nominees. Meanwhile, innumerable lives were lost at the front. With magnificent, unheard of heroism, the Russian troops went submissively to their death. Spread over a vast front of some thousands of versts, they were fighting under conditions which no other soldiers in the world could have endured. Beset by terrible frost, often deprived of all rations, they held the snow-filled trenches, never dreaming of retreat. Certain sections, owing to shortage of ammunition, fell under the enemy's fire without ever being able to reply. Whole regiments endeavored to repulse attacks with their bare fists. Others went over the top, armed with only sticks and stones. The Russian army did not grouse. It knew neither fatigue nor the fear of death, whether in defending its own territories or in sacrificing itself in support of its allies. For instance, before the Battle of the Marne, the whole army of General Samsonov, with full knowledge that it was going to certain death, broke into eastern Prussia in order to draw part of the enemy forces from the French to the Russian front. The Germans, alarmed at this unexpected advance, reduced their forces on the western front. The French gained a victory, but the Russian troops in eastern Prussia were sacrificed in order to ensure it. Russia felt those sacrifices. She felt how the lifeblood flowed from her, the blood of her best and bravest, who were gladly dying for their country and for the common cause. The people became doubly anxious. Was everything possible being done for the army? Were those at the base, to whom was entrusted the responsibility of supplying and arming the troops, conscientiously carrying out their duty? There were rumors of speculation and peculation and even treachery. As soon as the emperor, thanks to Rasputin's intrigues, had transferred the Grand Duke Nicholas Nikolaevich to the Caucasian front and had himself assumed the supreme command, the starets began to be an almost daily visitor at Tsarskoye Selo, where he gave his advice on affairs of state. His meetings with the empress usually took place in Vyrubova's house. Not a single important event at the front was decided without a preliminary conference with the starets. From Tsarskoye Selo, instructions were given to general headquarters on the direct telegraph line. The empress insisted on being kept fully informed by the emperor on the military and political situation. On receiving this information, sometimes secret and of the utmost importance, she would send for Rasputin and confer with him. When it is remembered by whom Rasputin was surrounded, it ceases to be surprising that almost every one of our attacks was known to the Germans beforehand, and that they should have been aware of all plans and changes contemplated in military or political spheres. Germany took the necessary measures to secure her victories and to prepare our destruction. I decided to attach no particular importance to all the disturbing rumors which were rife, but first of all, to obtain irrefutable evidence of Rasputin's treason. My opportunities for this reconnaissance would not have been more favorable. The G's were at the time living on the Moika, next to the Grand Duke Alexander Mikhailovich's palace, into which I had moved pending the completion of alterations in our own house. As I've already said, Em and I were very old friends. She often invited me to visit her, but I seldom went, for I had no desire to enter the sphere of Rasputin's influence, still less to have my name connected with those of his friends who constantly gathered at her mother's house. Now, however, since I was bent on completely unraveling the mystery of Rasputin's character and actions by means of a closer acquaintanceship with him, I decided to take advantage of M's invitations. Incidentally, it was interesting to discuss in detail with M herself the state of affairs in Russia. Knowing her blind adoration of Rasputin, I could not, of course, attach any weight whatever to her views, but I knew that they were an exact reproduction of opinions held at Tsarskoye Selo. I telephoned her to arrange a visit, and at the appointed hour I went to see her. M told me that Rasputin was constantly asking about me. "He is very anxious to see you," she said. "He is coming here one of these days. I will let you know which." My further conversation with her convinced me that Rasputin still enjoyed the unlimited confidence of the Emperor and Empress and continued to play the part of their most trusted advisor on political and family matters. M again sang his praises. Full of emotion, she told me how the Starets humbly endured slander and persecution, and by these unmerited sufferings he redeemed our sins. Her enthusiasm prompted me to touch upon Rasputin's adventures. "How do you explain this good man's habit of defiling his saintliness with drunken revels?" M was indignant. She blushed deeply and replied with some heat, "You surely realize that all those tales are nothing but black and slanderous lies. He is surrounded by envy and malice. Evil-minded people invent charges and purposely distort facts in order to blacken him, an innocent man, in the eyes of the Emperor and Empress. It is all too terrible." "But," I answered, "you must be aware that there are proofs in the shape of photographs and the tested evidence of witnesses, leaving no doubt whatever that he is by no means the holy man you make him out to be. Why, for instance, should the gypsies be talking about his visits to them, his drinking and dancing with them? Besides, many people have met him there. And in the Villa Road restaurant, where he goes most of all, there is even a private room bearing his name. How do you explain all that?" "There you are. You talk like everyone else, and you believe it," exclaimed M indignantly. "Remember that even if he does all these things, it is with a special purpose. He wants to harden himself morally, and by resisting temptation, to stamp out all those baser desires." "And the ministers he appoints and dismisses, is that also to stamp out desires and to perfect his morality?" I asked with a smile. And became angry at this and said that she would complain about me to Grigory Efimovitch. That's a nickname for Rasputin. That's his real name, I guess. It made my heart ache to see the unfortunate girl's fanatical belief in the purity and infallibility of this disreputable adventurer. She would not accept my proofs of his depravity. Every word of mine seemed as if shattered on the rock of her enslaved intelligence. I realized that she had lost the power of independent judgment, and that she dared not look upon her idol with a critical eye. I then tried to make clear to her, from another point of view, the harm that his presence did to the royal family. "Very well, then, we will assume for the moment that all this talk about his behavior is pure invention, but you cannot ignore public opinion in Russia and throughout Europe. Both here and abroad, Rasputin is regarded as a scoundrel and a spy. His nearness to the throne upsets the whole country and alarms our allies. Is not that a sufficient reason for securing his removal from the presence of the Emperor and Empress?" "Nobody has the right to criticize the actions of the Emperor and Empress. What they do concerns no one," she replied hotly. "They stand by themselves above all public opinion." "And supposing," I said, "that Grigory Efimovitch is an unconscious weapon in the hands of Russia's enemies, who carry out through him their criminal plans for the ruin of Russia, what then? Would you, even under these conditions, still consider his presence useful at Tsarskoye Selo? And besides, you yourself have told me that Grigory Efimovitch not only prays and speaks of religion with the Emperor and Empress, but that he also discusses with them the most important affairs of state. You know very well that not a single decision is taken without his approval, not a minister is appointed without his knowledge. Remember that whatever his spiritual qualities may be, good or bad, he is first and foremost an unenlightened and uneducated muzhik. Why, he can scarcely write. What can he understand about complicated questions of war, politics, and internal administration? What advice can he give on these matters? And if he does give such advice, then there are obviously people behind him who are secretly directing him. You do not know these people or their aims. What right, then, have you to affirm that all the actions of Grigory Efimovitch are good and helpful?" Again, I tell you, the proximity to the throne of a man with such a terrible reputation undermines the authority of the Tsar everywhere. Dissatisfaction grows, indignation is universal, and if those at the head of the state do not realize this, events may happen which will overthrow everything. M looked at me with a pitying expression, as if I were an innocent child, and in answer to my impassioned speech said, "You talk like this simply because you do not know or understand Grigory Efimovitch. Get to know him better, and if he takes a liking to you, then you yourself will become convinced of his exceptional and wonderful qualities. He cannot be mistaken in people. God himself has given him such perspicacity that just by looking at a person, he can immediately read his thoughts. That is why he is loved at Tsarskoye Selo, and of course they trust him in everything. He helps the emperor and empress to discern every person's character. He protects them from fraud, from every dangerous influence. If it were not for Grigory Efimovitch, everything would have been ruined long ago," she concluded, in a tone of absolute conviction. I put an end to this fruitless conversation. I said goodbye and went away. On reaching home, I began to turn over in my mind my future course of action. This discussion only served to strengthen my conviction that it was impossible to fight against Rasputin's influence with mere words. Logic was of no avail. The clearest arguments would not convince those whose judgment was clouded. I realized that no more time must be wasted in talk. It was necessary to take action, deliberately and with energy, while all was not yet lost. Chapter 4. The resolve to do away with the starets. I decided to consult certain influential people and tell them all I knew of Rasputin's doings. The impressions that I carried away from these conversations were very discouraging. In the past, I had so often heard them denounce Rasputin in the most bitter terms, attributing to him all our evils and misfortunes, and maintaining that if it were not for him, the positions might still be saved. But when I suggested that it was time to pass from words to deeds, I was told that his importance at Tsarskoye Selo had been greatly exaggerated by empty rumors. I do not know whether their evasive attitude was dictated by their fear of losing their posts, or whether they lightheartedly hoped that nothing terrible would happen, but that time would put everything right. And in either case, I was astonished at the absence of any alarm for the country's fate. It was clear that their addiction to a quiet life and an eager desire for their own welfare impelled them to avoid any kind of decisive action which would necessitate departure from the beaten track. I think they were all convinced of one thing, that the old order of things would in any case remain unchanged. They relied on this order as if it were as firm as a rock, and the rest, whether their country would emerge victorious from this terrible war, whether all the blood poured out by Russians would be spilt in vain, whether a disastrous defeat would be the tragic end of the nation's enthusiasm, did not worry them overmuch. Least of all, they were capable of realizing that an appalling catastrophe was drawing nearer and nearer, and had already assumed definite shape. True, I did meet certain people who shared my fears, but they were powerless to help me. One of them, an elderly man who held a responsible post at the time, said to me, "Dear fellow, what can one do when the entire government and those who are in close contact with the emperor are, without exception, Rasputin's nominees? The only way out is to kill the blackguard. But unfortunately, there isn't a man in Russia to do that. If I were not so old, I'd do it myself." When I saw that there was no help forthcoming from any direction, I decided to act independently. No matter what I was doing, no matter to whom I was talking, I was haunted by one persistent idea, the idea of delivering Russia from her most dangerous internal enemy. I would often awake in the middle of the night and pace up and down the room. How can one kill a man and deliberately plan his murder? The thought oppressed and tormented me until a voice within me said, quote, "Every murder is a crime and a sin, but in the name of your country, you must take this sin on your conscience. You must take it without faltering. At the front, millions of innocent men have been killed. While here there is only one man who must die. And of all the enemies of your country, he is the most pernicious, the most cynical, and the most vile. His abominable deceit has made the Russian throne his fortress, and no one has power to drive him forth. Come what will, you must destroy him. All my doubts and hesitations vanished. I felt a calm resolution and gave myself over to the set purpose of destroying Rasputin. The idea took deep and firm root in my mind and guided all my subsequent actions. Chapter 5. My inquiries. I mentally ran through the list of those of my friends whom I could entrust my secret and chose two. They were the Grand Duke Dmitri Pavlovich and Captain Sukhotin. The Grand Duke was at GHQ, but he was soon to arrive in St. Petersburg. Captain Sukhotin, who was undergoing treatment for wounds received in action, I saw almost daily. I decided not to delay any longer, but to confer with him at once. I outlined my plan in general terms and asked him if he wished to take part in carrying it out. He consented without the slightest hesitation, telling me he agreed with my views and shared my fears. On the same day, the Grand Duke Dmitri Pavlovich arrived from GHQ. As soon as I had returned home from my visit to Sukhotin, I telephoned to the Grand Duke and arranged to call and see him at 5 o'clock that afternoon. I was sure that he would support me and be willing to take part in the fulfillment of my plan. I knew how he detested Rasputin and how deeply he felt for the emperor in Russia. For very many reasons, I attributed great importance to his participation in the plot. I realized the necessity of being prepared for the most distressing possibilities, the most fateful issues, but I was buoyed up by the hope that the destruction of Rasputin would save the Tsar's family, and that the emperor, roused from the spell which had been cast on him, would lead the country to a decisive victory at the head of his united people. The crucial moment of the war was drawing near. In the spring of 1917, the Allies proposed to launch a general attack on all fronts. Russia was energetically preparing her army for this move, but a purely technical preparation on the front and at the base was insufficient to inflict a decisive blow on the enemy. It was essential that there should be a strong feeling of unanimity between the supreme power and the people. Yet the shadow of Rasputin continued to hang like a cloud over GHQ and St. Petersburg. Needless to say, Germany was not slumbering. While putting down barbed wire entanglements in front of her lines, she was busy weaving her terrible nets within Russia herself. Germany had made a close study of the internal situation in Russia for many years before the war. At the time when the Kaiser Wilhelm, foreseeing the inevitability of a general European war, was making every effort to bring about a Russo-German alliance, he warned Emperor Nicholas against Rasputin and advised him to see no more of this dangerous and pernicious man. The German emperor realized that Rasputin's proximity to the throne compromised not only the Russian Tsar, but the monarchy as a whole. After the proposals for alliance had been rejected, however, and especially after war had been declared, the Kaiser made very adroit use of Rasputin's influence. The German general staff, all unseen, held him in their hands by means of money and the most subtle intrigues. Simultaneously, the Germans exerted every effort to provoke a revolution in Russia. They sent their agents into our midst and gave all kinds of support to revolutionary organizations abroad, which were constantly preparing the ground and watching the moment for an attack. In point of fact, the Germans had counted on a Russian revolution before August 1914. There were persistent reports that just before the war was declared, Count Portales, the German ambassador in St. Petersburg, had informed his government in a telegram which had been intercepted and deciphered that the most favorable moment for hostilities had arrived, since Russia was on the brink of revolution. The contents of the telegram made it quite clear, moreover, that Germany had sent into Russia huge sums of money for propaganda. In the earlier phases of the war, the great patriotic response of the Russian people upset these calculations. The Germans began to make suggestions for a separate peace, but they nonetheless continued their revolutionary propaganda. I was looking forward with impatience to my meeting with the Grand Duke Dmitri Pavlovich, and at the appointed hour I went to the palace. I found him alone in his study, and at once proceeded to tell him what I had in mind. I gave him my views in detail on the situation, told him of my intentions, and asked him whether he would be ready to cooperate with me. As I had expected, he at once agreed, saying that in his opinion, Rasputin's death was the only effective means that remained of saving Russia from imminent disaster. He told me that he had long been tormented by the necessity of settling accounts with the Starets, but that he had not been able to conceive of how this could be done. In the course of our conversation, I gave the Grand Duke an account of my talk with M. He was not in the least surprised, and he was well aware of the attitude which prevailed at Tsarskoye Selo. He had to return to GHQ in a few days' time. He told me that his stay there would probably be a short one, as he was not liked there, and his influence is feared. He added that Volyakov made every effort to keep him away from the Emperor, who was completely in his hands. He then gave me his views on what was going on at GHQ. He had noticed that there was something wrong with the Emperor. Every day he became more indifferent to his surroundings and to the course of events. In my opinion, he concluded it is all part of some evil plot. I'm almost sure that he is being given drugs which obscure his intelligence and weaken his willpower. All this is terrible. It's a nightmare. At this point, our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of guests, and we had to postpone it. But we had arranged by that time that he next returned from GHQ. But we arranged that by the time he next returned from GHQ, he expected it would be between the 10th and 15th of December. I should work out a detailed plan for Rasputin's destruction and prepare everything for its fulfillment. On this we parted. Everything in principle was settled. I returned home, moved by strange feelings. The idea which had so disturbed and tormented me had now begun to pass from the realm of my own thoughts into reality. Not so very long ago, it had overwhelmed me like some confused delirium. But now I was no longer alone. I had adherents, friends with me. Everything was now decided, everything clear, and I felt an immense spiritual relief. In the evening, Sukhotin came to see me. I told him of my conversation with the Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, and we settled down to discuss our plan of action. It was decided that, first of all, I should get into close touch with Rasputin, obtain his confidence, and try to learn from his own lips as many details as possible concerning his participation in political events. Afterwards, we intended to try our utmost, not by extreme measures, but by peaceful persuasion or by the promise of large sums of money to sever his connection to Tsarskoye Selo. If these attempts should meet with complete failure, it only remained for us to destroy the criminal Starets. At this point, the question arose, how and where should we carry out the sentence on him? I suggested that three of us should draw lots, that whoever was chosen by destiny should contrive an entrance into Rasputin's flat and shoot him there. All right, that's page 80. I think I'll stop right there. My voice is going out. Yeah, historical book. People like the historical book episodes. Thanks, guys. So that was part 2. Part 3, I'll start on chapter 6, Rasputin among his female admirers. It just gets more and more interesting. Like, they literally are saying that, like, they think that the Nicholas II is being drugged. It makes perfect sense. Somebody's drugging him, like it's possible Rasputin or somebody else is doping him up. Okay, thanks for listening. Appreciate it. And you can find these other ones at William Ramsey Reads History. You can check that out. There's like 40 or 50 episodes. Thank you.